After a lengthy development cycle, Final Fantasy XIII arrived in late 2009, delivering cutting-edge visuals and a slick battle system. Yet it's clear that some fans of the series were perhaps disappointed with its rather straightforward design. With this in mind, Square Enix set out to rectify these complaints via a pair of direct sequels, Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Lightning Returns. While the original plan for this episode of DF Retro was focused exclusively on the original release of Final Fantasy XIII, my good friend Marc Duddleson from My Life in Gaming insisted on including the sequels. Thus, this second part in our Final Fantasy XIII retrospective is focused on just that, the sequels. So, let's dive in.
If you were only paying attention to Final Fantasy XIII's seemingly negative reception online, you probably never would have expected it to get any direct sequels in the vein of Final Fantasy X-2. But nonetheless, the game did in fact sell quite well, and Square Enix worked together with famed fellow RPG maker Tri-Ace to produce 2 sequels for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Final Fantasy XIII-2, released in late 2011 in Japan and early 2012 elsewhere, and Lightning Returns, released in late 2013 in Japan and early 2014 worldwide. And Steam releases for each sequel would follow in 2014 and 2015 respectively. Taking criticism against Final Fantasy XIII's inflexible linearity to heart, each sequel gives the player increasingly more agency in where they may go and in what order they complete essential tasks. Story critiques aside, I recall the atmosphere following the release of XIII-2 being generally positive, with the non-linear time-traveling gameplay satisfying players who were bored by 13, while Lightning Returns' overarching time limit, low fidelity asset quality, and frame rate woes seem to be sticking points for a lot of people, although it's actually my personal favorite of the trio, at least from a game design standpoint. Final Fantasy XIII-2 puts players in control of Lightning's sister Sarah and newcomer Noel, while Lightning Returns, as you might surmise from the title, brings Lightning back as the primary protagonist, the sole playable character this time around actually, with more significant battle system tweaks to make it work. We don't have the time to cover these games as intensively as the original Final Fantasy XIII, but we still have to give them a bit of attention. In line with industry trends, both sequels rely almost entirely on real-time cinematics and far less on Square Enix's signature style of full-motion video. As a result, the Xbox 360 versions of XIII-2 and Lightning Returns both fit on a single disc each. For what FMV does exist in these games, the Xbox 360 encoding is somewhat improved over XIII-1. During the opening cinematics in XIII-2, smudges and choppy keyframing over low contrast areas still stand out terribly, but the downgrade over PS3 isn't so stark this time around. In fact, areas of high detail, such as hair, can look minimally sharper on 360, if a touch noisy. In the FMV from Lightning Returns, you might notice a similar, just barely sharper look in the 360 version, but a heavier film grain effect has been introduced to go along with the game's darker tone, which is significantly more effective on PS3 and definitely causes smudging and macro blocking artifacts on 360. But where the 360 FMV completely falls apart are in XIII-2's TV-style recap segments that occur when loading a save.
Final Fantasy XIII-2, the story so far.
They are of somewhat poor quality on PS3 as well, but they're so bad on 360, almost to the point of parody. Perhaps they were meant to be used with a scrapped version for Nintendo DS? Joking aside, I think these recaps are a strange creative choice anyway, and have no real impact on the game itself. So the poor encoding quality is more of an amusing curiosity than a serious concern with the 360 version.
What we're concerned about, however, is this. You'll have to excuse the image quality.
A more obtrusive example of poor FMV is in the form of occasional pre-rendered flashbacks in XIII-2 that fade in over the real-time graphics. These are definitely rather ugly on Xbox, but even still, FMV is overall less essential in the sequels and improved just enough in quality on the 360 over the first game that it is no longer a compelling reason to avoid the Xbox versions this time around. In fact, loading sequences are more frequent and heavier in the sequels compared to the first game, and a full install to the Xbox 360 hard drive absolutely results in much faster loading compared to the PS3 versions. Or, well, that applies to 13-2 at least, where the wait to load into an area via the Historia Crux takes considerably longer on PS3. Lightning Returns, however, does have an optional installation from the disc available that seems to bring them quite close in load times. That's what you've seen here with an install on PS3, although I should stress that the PS3 load beating the 360 by just over a second here could be influenced by the SSD that's in my PS3, even though admittedly its benefits are quite limited for the console in general. In a lot of ways, the PS3 and 360 versions of the sequels are much closer in parity compared to the first game, with an internal rendering resolution of 1280 by 720 with 2x multi-sample anti-aliasing employed by both versions of 13-2 as well as Lightning Returns. Other graphics parameters are also a remarkably close match in both versions of both games, making them more visually indistinguishable than was typical of multi-platform releases at this time. In the Digital Foundry coverage of 13-2 back from when it released in 2012, Tom Morgan noted a difference in shadow filtering between the PS3 and Xbox 360. The impact isn't dramatic in most regards, but more complex shadow shapes like these palm fronds do appear less pixelated on Xbox 360. Shadow quality in both sequels is generally much lower resolution compared to the first game, although Lightning Returns attempts to mitigate this with some aggressive softening, something I actually wish more console games of its generation would have done. As a result, I think Lightning's own shadow looks quite good, all things considered. Even if a hard shadow would be more realistic in direct sunlight, I'd still take this over a jagged mess. But you can see from the very straight lines of the Finch shadow that the quality falls off quite close to the camera. And while the soft shadows may look quite nice under a tree canopy, the effect becomes unstable when the camera moves. As far as hair goes, well, I definitely think hair has an interesting look in the Final Fantasy XIII games, but 13-2 definitely suffers from quite a bit of aliasing in hair. If we take a look at Lightning's own evolution through the trilogy, her 13-2 hair has the most stippled appearance, while in Lightning Returns, the method used to filter the texture over her hair geometry seems to have been completely rethought, resulting in finer strands that don't look pixelated on close-ups. It's clear that in many areas, asset quality had to take a hit as each sequel became more open than the last. For the most part, I'd say that 13-2 is a reasonably close facsimile of the splendor of 13-1, with the cutbacks not becoming painfully apparent until the next game. Real-time cutscenes in 13-2 were already of a lot more variable quality and never reached the heights of the first game's cinematics. And even the best quality cutscenes in 13-2 rarely, if ever, have anything close to the level of facial expressiveness that is regularly on display in 13-1. But Lightning Returns definitely has some pretty junky looking NPC conversations, the very thing that 13-1 tried so hard to avoid.
We have a bit of a problem, I'm afraid. So I was just consulting with the assistant here.
He doesn't look happy. Is he injured?
Something is wrong, that's for sure.
Through the power of Lightning Returns' now defunct social media sharing features, this admittedly hilariously low polygon dog with the texture of melted ice cream was presented many times in the court of Twitter as evidence of Square Enix's alleged laziness. Calling devs lazy is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Please don't do that, because obviously, it must have been necessary to cut some corners to open up the gameplay and ship these games on time and on budget. But admittedly, stuff like this real N64 looking metal pillar and similar assets do feel out of place in a 2013-2014 title. So yeah, while I think they're both very fun games to play, there's just no denying that neither sequel is as spectacular visually as the original game. Nonetheless, the overall art direction still shines through the muck most of the time in 13-2 and, well, some of the time in Lightning Returns. When it comes to frame rates, I get the feeling that Lightning Returns has the worst reputation, but this is perhaps a bit unfair, because the reality is that both sequels regularly fall far short of matching the standards of consistency that we'd come to expect over the console generation that would follow. In Square Enix and Tri-Ace's defense, choppy performance was widely accepted among console players at the time as a trade for wide-open exploration, and as RPGs, the impact on gameplay is minimal, but obviously this is still not preferable, and paints a picture of the shortcomings of Crystal Tools when it comes to more open gameplay with more going on. As far as 13-2 goes, frame rate analysis does seem to suggest that Crystal Tools continues to favor the PlayStation 3 over the Xbox 360. That said, it's hardly a victory that the PS Triple should be terribly proud of, as both platforms spend a considerable amount of time in the 20 to 30 FPS no man's land. When this happens, the PS3 often does have a 2 or 3 or even 5 or 6 frame advantage over the Xbox 360, whether in cutscenes, gameplay, or the QuickTime events that absolutely no one asked for. But the reality is that while both platforms have frequent enough moments of consistency, they are likely to soon give way to sustained choppiness. So yeah, the more ambitious gameplay has clearly come at a cost, but it's not all bad news all the time. Even in an environment like this rainy encampment with a moderate number of NPCs, both consoles can at times hit a flat line at 30 frames per second with correct frame pacing. PS3 hits its target more often, but even then, you'll just have to accept that frame rate imperfections will be as much a constant companion as Sarah's Moogle. And trust me, PS3 can drop hard too, with extremely populated zones like Academia perhaps hinting at why towns didn't really exist in the first game. I even managed to capture the Xbox 360 outperforming the PS3 in at least one scenario in 13-2, so the fortunes can absolutely be reversed. Not that anyone is having a smooth ride if they think they can ride this Super Bowl. As with the first 13, character close-ups and cutscenes also correlate closely to frame drops on both platforms, although the effect seems to hit harder here. The silver lining to all of this, though, is that regular enemy encounters do tend to run plenty well enough, even on Xbox 360. But what then of Lightning Returns? This one is interesting because it features what you might think of as 4 distinct mini open worlds, biomes I think you're supposed to call them these days, all of which can be accessed early in the game, and performance is often better or worse depending on the environment. And well, the situation is not great, especially in the natural terrain of the Wildlands region. You really shouldn't get attached to the idea of seeing a sustained 30 frames per second for more than a few seconds in a row here. A jaunt through the Wildlands demonstrates that gameplay deep into the 20s can be the norm for both PS3 and Xbox 360 here, especially in the forest. PS3 and 360 are often virtually matched, and while PS3 easily has more moments in the lead, 360 can also catch a second wind and pull ahead at times. Let's be real though, neither system should be very proud of what it's doing here. Much better overall are the cities of Luxarion and Yusnan. Here, buildings obscure distant views, but NPCs are more common and plentiful. Based on when you see dips and when you don't, I get the sense that NPC counts are well managed and have little impact on performance, even if it does look rather bad to see them fade in and out so often. Rather, dips away from 30 FPS seem to be related more to the environment, and this applies to the wildlands too. Draw distance, alpha transparencies on trees and the like, and likely various inefficiencies elsewhere. Frame drops tend to go hand in hand with the text pop-ups that trigger when entering a different sub-region. So it seems that memory management is perhaps not masked as well as it could be. Nonetheless, 30 FPS with momentary drops to 27 or so in the two cities is typical for both PS3 and Xbox 360, which is comparable enough, if not better than, much of what you'd see in 13-2. When I recorded this approach to the Luxarian Cathedral on PS3, I was impressed that it was turning in a near perfect lock on 30 frames per second, despite up to around 10 NPCs potentially being on screen at a time. Given that performance, I was surprised to see the 360 version struggling so mightily in comparison despite recording at the exact same in-game time under as similar of circumstances as possible. Interestingly, however, leaving the cathedral is nearly as equally poor on both machines, perhaps because the camera is pointed toward a more major part of town? And then we have a synchronized dip just immediately outside the building as some chunk of data is presumably swapped in, although the dip is significantly more severe on 360. That difference couldn't have been caused by the SSD in my PS3, right? Well, just to be sure, I removed the optional installation on PS3 and did the full run in and out of the cathedral again. And the results are the same for all intents and purposes. An essentially perfect approach, then 25 to 27 FPS for most of the exit, and a bigger dip just outside. A tiny bit heavier this time, but near enough to the margin of error that I'd wager that the installation and hard drive speed has somewhere between a negligible and non-existent impact on general performance. It takes up so little space though that it would be silly to even consider not using it, honestly. Now let's not forget the fourth region, the Dead Dunes. I actually love deserts, and I think the texture of the dunes themselves are among the better environmental materials in the game. Performance here is not perfect, nothing in the FF13 sequels ever is, but on PS3, 30 frames per second is absolutely the norm for a strong majority of the time. Xbox 360 struggles a bit more while wandering the dunes, but what really struck me is what happens during battle against the Desert Sahagan. When it darts through the sand and knocks lightning into the air, I mean, oof! You can count those frames on both hands. It would be remiss of me to not check such extreme conditions on the other console, and well, while the PS3's readout is more like a fingers and toes kind of deal, it's certainly not great either. It's not all bad news during battle though. Sure, the wildlands tend to be chuggy regardless of what enemy you're fighting, but that's par for the course for that region. But for the most part, the two cities aren't all that bad, especially on PS3 where you'll often see 30 FPS just like in the first two games. However, Xbox 360 has more frequent dips related to swapping between your three schemata, or jobs as I like to think of them, the outfits, equipment, and corresponding movesets that you customize for Lightning. So yeah, it's a shame that Lightning Returns can, at times, turn in the worst battle performance metrics in the trilogy, since it is a touch more action-based, particularly in regard to guard skills, which reward you for precise timing. As for cinematic performance, well, fully produced story-driven cutscenes in Lightning Returns are relatively infrequent compared to the jankier-looking gameplay-driven NPC conversations. But what is here often performs very poorly on both PS3 and Xbox 360. This relatively early game cutscene may not look like much of anything that would cause trouble, aside from the spooky particles emanating from Lumina, but both consoles struggle to hit 30 frames per second here except for the most fleeting of moments. While it is clear that the 360's dips are heavier at times, the average across the clip favors the PS3 by only about a single frame. The fact that Lightning Returns was released after the PS4 and Xbox One were already available, outside Japan at least, makes the graphical and performance shortcomings even more unfortunate, and the new consoles being out is probably why it was passed over for Digital Foundry coverage back then. and I can't help but wonder what native ports might have brought to the table, but luckily for owners of newer Xbox machines, these two titles are also available for backwards compatible play with significant enhancements, although the features on hand differ somewhat from the first Final Fantasy XIII. Since the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy landed on the Xbox backwards compatibility program in November 2018, 1 year after the release of the Xbox One X, 4K enhancements were on the table from the get-go. We already mentioned the massively improved FMV quality in the first game, which remains one of the backwards compatibility program's most exceptional achievements. And it literally is an exception, because FMV quality in the backwards compatible editions of both 13.2 and Lightning Returns is identical to how it is on Xbox 360. But of course, as we've already established, the sequels didn't need this upgrade nearly so badly. Nonetheless, this remains the PS3's primary advantage over Xbox backwards compatibility when it comes to the Final Fantasy XIII games. As with the first game, the Xbox One X and Series X machines massively boost resolution with a 3x scale on each axis. But the difference here is that while the Xbox 360 version of Final Fantasy XIII runs at a sub 720p resolution internally, the sequels are native 720p, meaning that this time the resolution goes all the way up to native 2160p and retains the original multi-sample anti-aliasing. And by the way, both sequels are on Game Pass at the time we're producing this video, so Series S owners can also easily play and benefit from a respectable bump to 1440p. Now, please keep in mind that we did decide to produce this episode in 1080p, which makes production go much more smoothly, but because of that, we do have to zoom in just a bit to really show you the relative difference. Otherwise, with full screen shots, you're seeing 2160p super sampled to 1080p. As with the first game, the menu and other 2D elements use a mixture of pixelated nearest neighbor and softer scaling. More consistency would be nice, but I suspect the backwards compatibility team couldn't target all elements for nearest neighbor due to how they were originally implemented. The image quality is further boosted with 16x anisotropic filtering and a much needed increase in shadow resolution. The improvement to shadows is most apparent in 13.2, while Lightning Returns' softening filter and extremely close to the camera shadow quality transition makes it less tangible. However, shadow stability while the camera is in motion is significantly better than what you'd see on PS3 or Xbox 360. Perhaps even more exciting is that, unlike the first game, both sequels support FPS boost on the series consoles. In FF13-2, this is mostly a very good thing. The new frame rate target of 60 per second can at times produce seemingly miraculous results like what you're seeing in this cutscene here, which on an actual Xbox 360 is usually running at frame rates that you couldn't even call cinematic if you were so inclined. But unfortunately, the burden of 6 times the pixels and a doubled frame rate target, all while being saddled with Xbox 360 games that often run poorly on their own native hardware, proves to be a bit much for the Series X to get through with sheer brute force at times. Drops can and will occur here and there in 13.2 during battle and while running around. But on the whole, I'm extremely happy with the results of FPS boost here, especially considering that matters are much worse in Lightning Returns, where in the Wildlands and elsewhere, inconsistent frame times can only be quelled by a VRR-capable display. Which does work great, by the way. Most of the time, Lightning Returns with FPS boost is running well within the Series X's low frame rate compensation range. So unfortunately, there's a sense that we've perhaps flown too close to the sun here. However, you do have a few other options to work around this other than VRR. Of course, if you have no problem with 30 FPS and would prefer consistency, then the Series X should chew through everything just fine if FPS boost is disabled. And something that we actually did not know until we got a helpful comment from Eduardo Vasquez on the pre-release version of this video for DF Retro supporters is that a graphics versus performance priority setting is available for Resolution Boost 360 games within the 360 menu that's brought up with the start and back buttons. This reduces the resolution down to the original settings, which helps Lightning Returns hit 60 FPS much more consistently. Too bad that this and FPS boosts aren't unified at the system level, but it's still good to have the option, because otherwise you would run into strange situations like this where the humble Xbox One VHS outperforms the Xbox One X. I don't mean to sound nitpicky though. I mean, after all, from the 2013 Xbox One all the way up to the Series X, you're easily getting better performance than Xbox 360 or PS3. So you can't go wrong playing these games on Xbox backwards compatibility. Alright, we really gotta start wrapping up here, but just one last footnote on Xbox backwards compatibility that I thought was just interesting. See here how 13.2's Crystarium interface performs on the old VCR model? It's not a total lock on 30, but it's close enough for what amounts to just a fancy menu. But then when we go over to the Series X with FPS boost, it's a lot further off the mark than you might expect. How does it perform on a real Xbox 360 though? Well, what do you know? As it turns out, a few elements update at 60 frames per second, or at least they attempt to. Perhaps more impactful to the experience, and certainly more successful at hitting 60 on Xbox 360, is the map screen. I point this out just because I thought it was surprising and interesting that you actually lose the higher frame rate elements that exist on PS3 and Xbox 360 with Xbox backwards compatibility due to a hard 30 FPS cap in these games. I never knew there were caveats like that until stumbling upon it myself. But with FPS boost, you can restore the original 60 FPS target, even if the target in the Crystarium still can't quite be met on Series S or Series X. Although Series S certainly manages to get a fair bit closer with its less ambitious resolution boost. Lastly here, while our focus has been on the original versions of these games, we do have to mention the PC ports on Steam, which arrived about 3 years after the console releases for 13.2, while Lightning Returns PC port landed about 2 years after PS3 and Xbox 360. Now, I'm going to be upfront that I'm a console man through and through, so upgrading my aging GTX 1080 Ti hasn't really been a priority. But even still, ports from PS3 tier hardware that supposedly could even run in Windows XP should play fine for me, right? Well, for now, just ignore any performance issues and let's focus on the basics. 13.2's PC launcher is pretty much exactly the same as the first games, which makes sense given that they released on PC only about 2 months apart. And as you might guess, it also inherits several of that version's issues as well. Choppy FMV, double buffer VSync, poor 1440p scaling, and a dearth of options in general. The game most definitely can look pretty nice, even though the core assets don't seem to be improved over the console versions in any obvious way. However, remember that palm tree comparison from before? Yeah, the PC shadow resolution can be very high, but it seems that alpha transparency may not be factored into shadow projection in the PC version. Rain also appears to be glitched, and it looks quite bad compared to the console releases, but you can fix this, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. But yeah, my initial impressions of 13.2 on PC were pretty poor, I have to admit. On my computer, the double buffer VSync is very much an issue, causing the game to effectively ping-pong between 60 frames per second and 30. And watching the game hard lock between 60 and 30 is honestly more unpleasant to my eye than the consistent inconsistency of the original console releases, if that makes sense. Luckily, if you're having these problems too, and even if you aren't, there's a GitHub with a project called FF13 Fix that addresses a number of issues with both the first and second games. This allows you to enable triple buffering and tweak several other parameters, and while my computer's results in this scenario ain't gonna be impressing no one, I think dropping like this when the game can't hit 60 is much less distracting compared to the default setup. And I think that the port quality and my Gen 1 AMD Threadripper may be partly to blame, because reducing the resolution to 720p didn't improve things much from the 1080p results shown here. I mean, look, I built this thing for video editing years ago. It's a work computer, okay? Anyway, the rain fix is a separate patch called Leviathan's Tears that I found in a Steam community guide posted by Surahix, which also goes over numerous ways to fix and enhance Final Fantasy XIII-2 on PC. It's recommended that this also be used with a 4GB virtual memory patcher by Eric Pistelli, which helps prevent crashing due to these games only being allocated 2GB of virtual memory, which is a problem on 64-bit systems even without mods, and I ran into a crash myself very early in the game on my unmodified fresh install. Amazingly enough, Lightning Returns is hardly a rehash of the same porting job, which is immediately apparent due to the lack of a front-end launcher. You're presented straight away with the pre-title FMV, which does run noticeably smoother than in the previous two PC ports, although the encoding quality is definitely not up to the standard of the PS3 version. Graphics settings are presented through a simple drop-down menu. This mostly amounts to 2 vague choices per item, but there are at least more options this time around, and everything changes instantly in real time. The good news is that my computer isn't a total potato despite what you may think, and hitting 60 frames per second, even at 3840 by 2160, even in the wildlands, is easier for me to achieve compared to just 1080p in 13.2. The bad news is that stutters are otherwise all over the place. Performance is very much not perfect. In pretty much the same spots that I noted larger drops on console when you're approaching a different sub-region, you'll almost certainly get a good bit of stutter. And it seems to be something that raw power and lower settings can't solve. John was able to confirm for me that this is also apparent on his significantly more powerful rig. It's hard to say what exactly is causing this, but it seems we can't escape the stutter struggle even when delving into ports of PS3 360 generation games. The game actually defaults to a quote-unquote fixed frame rate mode, which appears to be an attempt at a 30 FPS cap, but it's profoundly broken. I can't help but wonder if this is meant to mask the relative impact of the stutters. Hey, I'm telling you, consistent inconsistency, there might be something to it. I'm kidding. Mostly. And I have to admit, I was a bit shocked and impressed by the visual quality in this version of the game at first. Everything just seemed so clear to the point that I fooled myself into believing they'd pulled off a semi-proper PC upgrade this time. But as it turns out, it was just a placebo. It had been a while since I'd recorded footage from the game on Series X. And when I started putting comparisons together, I realized that visually, One X and Series X are an extremely close match to the Steam version in quality. It's mostly just the higher display resolution and significantly improved texture filtering that lets you see the clarity that is otherwise lost on PS3 and Xbox 360. So both PC and the higher-end Xbox consoles can achieve that with similar enough results. Even Lightning's face textures are actually super detailed on the console releases. It's just that you're more likely to notice playing up at a monitor than from a couch. You may, however, want to play with your GPU panel settings since the PC version is highly aliased in comparison to One X and Series X. So yeah, even in spite of their uneven presentation, I like these sequels quite a lot, and revisiting them has me really itching for a full replay. I mean, the story never mattered to me all that much in any of the Final Fantasy XIII games anyway. I mean, it's the gameplay, the music, and the atmosphere that kept me hooked through all of them. I mean, you've got 13-2 with more of that Final Fantasy XIII battle system goodness, and otherwise it feels like it could have been a Chrono Trigger sequel in an alternate universe. it's very enjoyable to explore the branching timelines and tie up all the loose ends. Meanwhile, the existence of Lightning Returns completely puzzles me because I'm not sure who they thought would enjoy it other than me. I've long loved time management and time limit mechanics in games like The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask and Pikmin, where the pressure of being sure you're using your time wisely actually really draws me in and keeps me hooked. But that kind of thing is immediately a turnoff for a lot of others, although I'd argue that it's actually extremely generous with the time it gives you, alongside the ability to earn extra days and freeze time. I also love how you actually have to, pay attention to what characters say and look for clues in the environment based on the information you have, rather than just mindlessly go from waypoint to waypoint. It's an open world, yes, but one that doesn't hold your hand too much and never left me bored. I also really enjoy how the core gameplay systems essentially let you create your own Final Fantasy jobs. The battle system from the first two games is probably a bit better, but I still think what's here is really, really good, and I just think Lightning Returns is the most fun to play Final Fantasy 13 game when taken as a whole, even though I'm pretty sure my opinion on that is a bit of an outlier. At any rate, if you, like John and I, love the idea of open worlds but rarely enjoy the way they're executed, give Lightning Returns a try. It certainly ranks very near the top of the open world pile for me.
With Lightning Returns on shelves and the new generation of consoles available, the door on Fabula Nova Crystallis was gently closed and Final Fantasy would once again move forward. But this is the natural state of Final Fantasy. After all, it's a series that has always existed in a state of flux. Each new mainline entry and its supporting games represent a specific flavor unique to a specific platform and moment in time. It's one of the greatest strengths of the series, but also represents a significant financial risk that would only increase as modern game budgets continue to explode. It is from this perspective which I believe Fabula Nova Crystallis was born. It represents an opportunity to architect a brand new world and characters that could persist across multiple games. It remains one of the most ambitious projects in Square Enix history. The challenge of building a cross-game technology platform designed to produce such high-fidelity visuals cannot be understated. It was a massive undertaking, and it shows in the final product with its super streamlined design. Some things worked brilliantly, other things perhaps not so much. Final Fantasy XIII is also the Final Fantasy of an entire generation of consoles. It's basically synonymous with PlayStation 3 and HD gaming, and it represents both the strengths and struggles many developers faced during this era in the transition to HD machines. A product of flawed ambition, but one worth playing all the same. It also happens to be the last mainline Final Fantasy game to offer true turn-based combat, yet its streamlined nature also serves as a bridge to the more action-driven games of today. Sure, it was a painful step, but it was a necessary one. And this project would help Square Enix find the way forward for its future game projects. Taking on its own merits, I think I can speak for both Mark and myself when I say that we deeply respect and enjoy the exploratory nature of Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels. It is, in a way, the most wildly experimental era in Final Fantasy history, and for that, I believe it deserves its place in the history books.